The frost didn't freeze my memory. There is a particular kind of hatred that does not announce itself with shouting, because it has learned, over decades, that shouting is inefficient. It prefers silence and patience and the long, slow accumulation of small and deniable cruelties, and it waits, with the terrible discipline of someone who has spent a lifetime getting exactly what she wants, for the one moment when the person standing between her and her purpose is finally, completely, and unavoidably out of the room. This is the story of what happened in that room during the 6 months a husband was gone, and of the reckoning that arrived when he came home to find it. Evangeline Marchetti had married Alistair Renfrew, the 9th Duke of Ravensmore, 18 months before the events of this story, in a match that had scandalized the more conservative corners of the northern aristocracy, for reasons that had nothing to do with Evangeline's character, and everything to do with the accident of her birth. She was the daughter of an Italian silk merchant, and an English mother of modest gentry standing, clever, cultured, raised in 2 languages and 2 cultures, with the particular grace of someone who has learned to move fluently between different worlds, but possessed of a lineage that the oldest families of the northern provinces, families who trace their bloodlines back through unbroken generations of English nobility, considered, in the private and vicious calculus of their own snobbery, essentially without value. Alistair had not cared about any of this in the slightest. He had met Evangeline at a diplomatic reception in London, where her father's trading interests had brought the family into contact with circles considerably grander than their own station ordinarily afforded, and had fallen in love with her within the space of a single evening, not for her lineage, which meant nothing to him, but for her mind, which he had found, from their very first conversation, more genuinely alive and more genuinely interesting than any woman's he had previously encountered in the whole of his considerable experience among London and northern society. He had married her within the year, against the loud and continuous objection of his mother, and had spent the 18 months since discovering, with a growing and complete conviction, that he had made the single best decision of his entire life. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice Renfrew, had never once accepted this conviction, and had spent the 18 months of her son's marriage nursing a resentment toward Evangeline that had, by the events of this story, calcified into something considerably more dangerous than simple disapproval. Beatrice was 61 years old, and she had governed Ravensmore estate, its household, its finances, its considerable influence within the northern province's social hierarchy, for nearly 40 years, first as the wife of Alistair's father, and then, following his death 12 years earlier, as the dominant and largely unchallenged authority of her son's household during the long years before his own marriage. She had built her entire sense of self around this authority, and around the particular and unyielding conviction, absorbed from her own upbringing and reinforced by 4 decades of unquestioned dominance, that bloodline was the single most important measure of a person's worth, and that the ancient houses of the northern provinces existed, by right and by nature, above the common trade and common blood that Beatrice believed, with an intensity that bordered on genuine religious conviction, defined and limited people like Evangeline for the whole of their lives. She had wanted, for Alistair, a match with Lady Lucinda Ashgrove, the daughter of an old northern family whose lands bordered Ravensmore's own, a young woman of considerable ambition and considerably less genuine substance than Evangeline, but possessed of exactly the bloodline Beatrice believed her son's wife required. Lucinda had wanted the match nearly as badly as Beatrice had wanted it for her, and the 2 women had spent the 18 months of Alistair's marriage to Evangeline bound together by a shared and mutually reinforcing resentment, waiting, though neither had said so explicitly, even to each other, until circumstances finally provided the opening, for the moment when Alistair's absence might allow them to act on it. That moment arrived in the early autumn of 1813, when Alistair was summoned by the Emperor's northern command to a military campaign along the contested border territories, an urgent and unavoidable duty that he could not decline, however desperately he wished, in the moment of his departure, that circumstances allowed him to remain at Ravensmore with the wife he had come to love more completely with every month of their marriage. He kissed Evangeline at the estate's gates on a grey October morning and told her, with a tenderness that she would carry with her through every one of the 6 terrible months that followed, that his mother would care for her in his absence exactly as she deserved to be cared for, as the Duchess of Ravensmore, as his wife, as the woman he loved beyond every other consideration his position might otherwise have required of him. He believed this completely. He had no way of knowing riding north toward the border campaign, exactly how wrong he was. The moment Alistair's carriage cleared the estate's outer gates, disappearing into the grey October morning, Beatrice Renfrew's entire demeanour toward her daughter-in-law transformed with a completeness and a speed that suggested the change had been planned, in careful and patient detail, for a very long time. She summoned Evangeline to the great hall within the hour, flanked by two of the estate's guards, and by Lucinda Ashgrove, who had arrived at Ravensmoor the previous week, under the pretext of an extended social visit, and had, Evangeline understood with a sinking and immediate clarity, been waiting for precisely this moment. "My son is not here to protect your delusions, girl," Beatrice said, and the word girl, delivered with the particular contempt Beatrice had spent 18 months carefully containing, landed on Evangeline with the force of a physical blow. She gestured to one of the guards, who stepped forward and threw, at Evangeline's feet, a rough and threadbare maid's uniform, the fabric coarse and grey, and utterly unlike anything Evangeline had worn since her marriage. "You are a commoner, and you will work like one, for the whole of my son's absence. You will address me as your grace, and you will address Lady Lucinda with proper respect. And if you speak one word of complaint to the household staff, I will ensure that your father's trading vessels find themselves, through means I am perfectly capable of arranging, permanently unable to conduct business in any port under this empire's authority. Your family's lands and livelihood are considerably more vulnerable than you have ever allowed yourself to understand, and I promise you, I will burn every part of them before I allow you to remain, unchallenged, in a position you have no genuine right to occupy." Evangeline stood in the great hall, looking at the rough grey uniform at her feet, and felt something in her understanding of her own marriage, of the safety she had believed, until this moment, her marriage guaranteed her, collapse entirely. But Evangeline Marchetti had not been raised by an Italian father who had built his own trading empire from very little, through decades of patient and disciplined endurance, to simply collapse alongside it. She bent and picked up the uniform and looked at Beatrice with an expression that gave the older woman nothing. No tears, no pleading, no visible fracture of the composure Evangeline had spent her entire life cultivating, precisely for moments such as this one. "I understand, Your Grace," she said, in a voice that remained, despite everything happening within her, entirely steady. Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly at this response, some small and unacknowledged part of her having expected, and perhaps even hoped for, a greater and more satisfying display of distress. But she said nothing further, simply gestured for the guards to escort Evangeline to the servants' quarters, and the 6-month nightmare of Evangeline's captivity within her own home properly began. What followed, over the ensuing months, was a systematic and deliberately calibrated campaign of humiliation, conducted with the particular cruelty of two women who understood, precisely because of their own privileged upbringing, exactly which indignities would cut deepest into a woman who had, until recently, occupied a position of genuine dignity and authority. Evangeline was assigned the estate's most physically demanding domestic labor, the scrubbing of the great hall's marble floors, the same floors she had, for 18 months, walked across as its mistress, now approached on her knees with a brush and a bucket of cold water, her hands, unaccustomed to such labor, blistering and then calloused over the passing weeks. Lucinda took a particular and evident pleasure in manufacturing occasions for further humiliation, spilling wine deliberately across freshly scrubbed marble, simply to watch Evangeline clean it again, offering small and pointed comments about Evangeline's lineage and her unsuitability for the position she had briefly occupied, always delivered with a smile calibrated to appear, to any observer who might happen upon the scene, like ordinary and unremarkable conversation between a lady and a servant. Beatrice controlled the mechanics of Evangeline's daily existence with the same careful and deliberate precision she brought to everything. Meals reduced to the barest sustenance, a small and unheated room in the servants' quarters, replacing the grand apartments Evangeline had shared with Alistair, every small privilege of her former position systematically stripped away and replaced with the specific and calculated deprivations of Beatrice's design. Evangeline endured it. She endured it with a silence that she understood, even in her most difficult moments, was itself a form of resistance, refusing to give Beatrice or Lucinda the satisfaction of visible distress, maintaining, beneath the rough uniform and the blistered hands, the same essential dignity that had first drawn Alistair to her at that London reception 18 months before. She thought, In the long and difficult hours of scrubbing marble floors she had once walked as a duchess, of her father, and of the particular resilience he had modeled for her throughout her childhood, the patient and undramatic endurance of a man who had built an entire trading empire, not through any single dramatic moment of triumph, but through years of quiet, disciplined persistence in the face of obstacles that would have broken a lesser man's resolve. She thought too of Alistair, and held to a conviction that Beatrice's cruelty could not entirely extinguish, however hard the older woman worked to break it, a conviction that her husband, whatever lies or manipulations his mother might construct in his absence, loved her genuinely and completely, and would, upon his return, uncover the truth of what had been done to her. She did not know, in the months of her captivity, whether this conviction was justified, or simply the last fragile thread of hope she had left to hold on to. She held to it anyway, because the alternative, surrendering entirely to Beatrice's design, breaking in the way the older woman so evidently wanted her to break, was not, Evangeline understood with a clarity that carried her through the worst of the 6 months, a surrender she was willing to make. The breaking point, when it finally arrived, came 2 weeks before Alistair's scheduled return, precipitated by an act of defiance that Evangeline had not planned so much as simply found herself, after 5 months of accumulated endurance, no longer capable of suppressing. Lucinda had summoned her, one evening, to the drawing room where she and Beatrice were entertaining several of the northern province's most significant families, ostensibly to have Evangeline attend to some minor domestic task, but in fact, as had become an increasingly frequent pattern over the preceding months, to display the fallen Duchess's humiliation before an audience whose good opinion Beatrice and Lucinda both, in their different ways, valued. "Kneel and greet our guests properly, girl," Lucinda said, with a particular satisfaction she had come to take in issuing such commands, gesturing toward the assembled company with an expectant and cruel smile. Evangeline, standing in the doorway of the drawing room in her rough grey uniform, her hands still raw from the day's labor, looked at Lucinda and at the assembled guests watching with varying degrees of discomfort and cruel curiosity, and felt something in her 5 months of careful and disciplined endurance finally, completely give way, not into tears, not into pleading, but into a refusal so absolute and so unshakable that it arrived, in the moment, almost as a relief. "No," Evangeline said. The single word landed in the drawing room with a force that silenced every other conversation instantly. "I beg your pardon?" Lucinda said, her composure faltering for the first time in 5 months of otherwise untroubled cruelty. "I said no," Evangeline repeated, her voice steady and entirely clear. "I have scrubbed your floors and worn your rags, and endured 5 months of a cruelty I have done nothing whatsoever to deserve, but I will not kneel to you, Lucinda Ashgrove, in front of guests you have gathered, specifically to witness my humiliation. Whatever else you take from me, you will not take that." Beatrice rose from her chair with a fury that had, evidently, been building beneath her careful surface composure for the entire 5 months of Evangeline's unbroken resistance, unable, despite everything she had inflicted, to fully extinguish the essential dignity she found so intolerable in her son's wife. "Take her to the North Tower cellars," Beatrice commanded the guards, her voice carrying a cold and absolute finality that left no room whatsoever for negotiation. "Let the winter frost break that stubborn spine of hers, since nothing else has managed it." Evangeline was dragged, that same evening, down through the estate's oldest and least maintained corridors, to the abandoned stone cellars beneath the North Tower, a section of Ravensmoor that had not been properly used or heated in over a generation, its walls damp and freezing, even in the relative mildness of the surrounding months, now in the deepening cold of approaching winter, a genuine and mortal danger to anyone confined within it, for any significant length of time. The guards locked her into a windowless stone room, with nothing beyond a single thin blanket, and a bowl of scraps that would need to sustain her for however long Beatrice intended her confinement to last, and Beatrice herself, appearing briefly at the room's iron grate before the guards departed, delivered a final and devastating pronouncement through the bars. "Let the winter frost break that stubborn spine of yours," she said, and there was, in her voice, a satisfaction so complete and so untroubled by any genuine conscience that Evangeline understood, in that moment, with a clarity that carried her through the following 2 weeks, that she was dealing with a woman entirely and permanently beyond the reach of any appeal to decency or mercy. The 2 weeks that followed were the most difficult of Evangeline's entire life. The cold of the stone cellar was a living and constant presence, seeping into every part of her body with a persistence that the single thin blanket did almost nothing to counter. Her fingers, within days, had turned a bloodless and frightening white that she understood, with the small remaining portion of her mind, still capable of clinical assessment, indicated a genuine risk to her health that could, if the confinement continued much longer, become considerably more serious than mere discomfort. She sat in the darkness, shivering violently through the coldest hours of each night, and found, in the depths of an ordeal that would have broken most people entirely, a particular and unexpected clarity settling over her. Not despair, though despair pressed constantly at the edges of her endurance, but a kind of fierce and unbreakable determination that she drew, in those darkest hours, from every resource her life had given her to draw upon. She thought of her father, who had once told her, during a difficult period in his own business career, when a rival's sabotage had nearly destroyed everything he had built, that the people who ultimately triumph over deliberate cruelty are very rarely the ones who fight back loudly in the moment, but the ones who simply refuse, with quiet and unyielding persistence, to let the cruelty define the whole of what happens next. She thought of Alistair, and held to her conviction of his love with a determination that the cold itself seemed, in some strange and inexplicable way, to sharpen rather than diminish. She counted the days. She did not know the precise date of Alistair's scheduled return, but she understood, from fragments of conversation she had overheard among the household staff during her months of servitude, that it was approaching, and she held to that approaching date with the same fierce and disciplined focus she had brought to every other aspect of her endurance. Understanding, with a certainty that felt, in the depths of the coldest nights, like the only warm and solid thing she still possessed, that the storm of her husband's return was coming, and that when it arrived, it would arrive in her favor. What Evangeline did not know, confined in the darkness of the North Tower cellars, was that Alistair's cousin, Lord Stirling Renfrew, had returned to Ravensmoor 2 days ahead of the schedule everyone had expected, having concluded his own portion of the northern campaign somewhat earlier than anticipated, and had arrived at the estate to find a household staff whose fear and evident distress, visible in every downcast glance and every trembling hand, told him immediately that something had gone very seriously wrong during his absence. Lord Stirling had known Evangeline for the full 18 months of her marriage to his cousin, and had, from their very first meeting, formed a genuine respect for her character that made the household's obvious and pervasive fear, upon his arrival, immediately and deeply alarming. He questioned the household staff directly, in the private and careful manner of a man who understood that fear this complete required careful and patient extraction rather than blunt demand, and pieced together, over the course of a single evening, enough fragments of the truth to understand, with a mounting horror, the general shape of what Beatrice had done during her son's 6-month absence. He did not have the standing to intervene directly. Beatrice's authority as Dowager Duchess, and the deep and complicated deference the household staff owed her regardless of their private horror at what she had done, meant that Stirling, arriving without his cousin's own authority to override his mother's commands, could do little beyond confirming the truth and preparing to deliver it, in full and devastating detail, the moment Alistair himself returned. That moment arrived 2 days later, when Alistair rode into the Ravensmoor courtyard on a cold November morning, exhausted from 6 months of grueling campaign, but buoyed by a desperate and overwhelming eagerness to see the wife he had thought of, with an intensity that had carried him through every difficult day of the northern border conflict. In nearly every quiet moment his duties allowed him. The estate, he saw immediately upon his arrival, had been prepared with an elaborate and evidently deliberate perfection, the grounds manicured beyond their ordinary standard, the household staff arranged in careful and formal welcome, Beatrice and Lucinda standing on the front steps in gowns of considerable luxury, smiling with a warmth that Alistair, in his first exhausted moments of homecoming, registered only as the ordinary and expected welcome of a household glad to see its duke returned. He looked past them, scanning the assembled staff and the courtyard beyond with a growing and specific urgency, searching for the one face he had ridden 6 months and hundreds of miles to see. "Where is Evangeline?" he asked, dismounting with a speed that betrayed the full extent of his eagerness. "Why is she not at the gates to welcome me?" Beatrice's expression arranged itself, with a practiced and devastating speed, into a mask of gentle and sorrowful reluctance. "Oh, my dear boy," she said, crossing to embrace her son with a warmth calculated precisely to disarm whatever alarm his question might otherwise have provoked. "I did not wish to greet you with such news the very moment you arrived home, exhausted from your campaign. Your wife proved, I am devastated to tell you, incredibly unfaithful and unstable in your absence. Within the first month of your departure, she took a considerable sum of gold from the estate's accounts and fled to the countryside with a common traveller she had apparently been conducting some manner of secret liaison with. We searched for her, of course, out of concern for the family's dignity if nothing else, but she had clearly planned her departure with some care, and we were unable to locate her. I am so terribly sorry, Alistair. She abandoned you, and I fear she was never quite what either of us believed her to be." Alistair stood in the courtyard, his exhausted body suddenly rigid with a shock so complete it felt, in the first instant, almost like physical pain. But even through the devastating force of what his mother had just told him, some deep and unshakable part of his own understanding of his wife's character refused, almost immediately, to accept the story at face value. He looked at his mother's face, searching for the genuine grief such news should have produced in a woman describing the collapse of her son's marriage, and found instead, beneath the careful arrangement of sorrow, something he could not initially name, but that struck him, even in his shock, as deeply and specifically wrong. He looked at Lucinda, standing slightly behind Beatrice, and saw in her expression an eagerness, poorly concealed beneath her own attempt at sympathetic solemnity, that had no business appearing anywhere in a story of genuine tragedy. And he looked, finally, at the assembled household staff, standing in their formal rows of welcome, and saw every single one of them looking fixedly at the ground, their hands, he noticed, with a mounting and specific horror, visibly trembling. Something was deeply and unmistakably wrong. Alistair Renfrew, 9th Duke of Ravensmore, had led men in 6 months of brutal border conflict, and he had learned, across that campaign, to read the true shape of a situation beneath its surface presentation with a clarity that battle demanded, and that his mother's careful performance, however skillfully arranged, could not entirely defeat. "Where is she?" he said again, and his voice had dropped into a register that made even Beatrice, for the first time in the exchange, visibly falter. He found the answer not from his mother, but from his cousin, who cornered him in the estate's armory, within the hour, having watched the courtyard scene with a mounting and finally unbearable horror at his own inability to intervene in the moment. "Your mother is lying to you, Alistair," Sterling said, his voice low and urgent. "Evangeline never left this estate. I arrived 2 days ago and found a household staff too terrified to speak plainly, but I have pieced together enough to know the truth is considerably worse than anything your mother has told you. Follow the ash trail from the servants' kitchen. It leads toward the North Tower. That is where you will find her, if she still lives." Alistair did not wait to hear more. He drew his sword, an act so instinctive, born of 6 months of a soldier's reflexes, that he scarcely registered doing it, and strode from the armory with an expression that Sterling, following close behind, alongside several of Alistair's most loyal knights who had accompanied him home from the campaign, would later describe as the most purely and terrifyingly furious he had ever witnessed on his cousin's face. He stormed past his mother, who attempted, with a rapidly collapsing composure, to intercept him in the great hall, demanding to know what Sterling had told him, and insisting, with a shrillness that had entirely replaced her earlier careful performance of grief, that whatever lies were being spread about her conduct during Alistair's absence were the product of servants' malicious gossip, rather than any genuine truth. Alistair did not stop to answer her. He crossed the estate with a speed and a singular focus that scattered household staff from his path, descended into the oldest and least maintained corridors beneath the North Tower, and arrived, within minutes, before the heavy oak doors that sealed off the abandoned cellars, doors that he kicked open with a violence that splintered the ancient wood, revealing the narrow stone passage beyond, and at its end, the iron-barred door of the cold room where his wife had spent the final and most desperate 2 weeks of her 6-month ordeal. He smashed the iron lock with the pommel of his sword, and the door swung open to reveal a sight that stopped him, for one devastating and eternal second, entirely in his tracks. Evangeline lay against the far wall of the freezing stone room, pale as a ghost, wrapped in the single thin blanket that had done almost nothing to protect her against 2 weeks of unrelenting winter cold. Her hands, visible where the blanket had slipped, bloodied and blistered from months of forced labor, and white with a cold that had come dangerously close to permanent damage. Her eyes, when they found him standing in the doorway, held a light that told him, even through the devastating physical evidence of what had been done to her, that whatever else his mother had managed to break in her 6 months of deliberate cruelty, she had not managed to break the essential and unshakable spirit of the woman he loved. Alistair dropped his sword. It clattered against the stone floor with a sound that neither of them, in the moment, fully registered. He crossed the small room in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her, wrapping his heavy fur cloak around her shivering frame with hands that shook nearly as violently as her own, and wept, openly, and without any attempt at the composure a duke was ordinarily expected to maintain, holding her face between his hands with a desperate and overwhelming tenderness. "Evangeline," he said, his voice breaking entirely. "Evangeline, look at me. Please, my love, look at me." Evangeline looked up into the eyes of the husband she had held on to, through 6 months of deliberate cruelty and 2 weeks of freezing darkness, with a conviction that had carried her through every single unbearable day, and found, at last, that her faith had not been misplaced. "Your mother told me I wasn't equal to sit at your table, Alistair," she whispered, her voice weak but carrying, even through the physical devastation of her ordeal, an unmistakable and unbroken sharpness. "So she put me in the dirt and told everyone I had abandoned you." She paused, gathering the strength for what remained, and when she continued, her voice carried something that was not merely defiance, but a kind of quiet and absolute triumph. "But the frost didn't freeze my memory, Alistair. I remember every single thing that was done to me, and I remember, through every hour of it, that you would come home." Alistair carried her from the cellar himself, refusing every offer of assistance from the knights and servants who had gathered, drawn by the commotion, at the entrance to the North Tower's ancient corridors. He carried her through the estate's main hall, past a household staff whose faces, for the first time in 6 months, showed something other than fear, a dawning and desperate hope that the reckoning they had all understood, in their private and helpless silence, was owed to Beatrice for what she had done, might finally, at last, be arriving. He carried her into the grand dining hall, where Beatrice and Lucinda sat, in a scene of grotesque and untroubled normalcy, taking tea with a composure that shattered instantly the moment Alistair appeared in the doorway, with his wife's broken and shivering body cradled against his chest. He crossed the room and set Evangeline down, with a gentleness that stood in devastating contrast to the fury visible in every other part of his bearing, in the high-backed master chair at the absolute head of the long table, the chair that had, for the whole of Beatrice's 40-year dominance of Ravensmoor, been reserved for whichever member of the family held the estate's genuine and unchallenged authority. He turned to face his mother, and the 2 women watched, frozen in their chairs, as the full weight of what they had done finally, completely, arrived to claim its consequence. "You stripped my wife of her crown," Alistair said, his voice vibrating with a controlled and absolute malice that neither Beatrice nor Lucinda had ever once heard from him in the whole of his life, "and put her in a cage in the coldest part of this estate, and told me, upon my return, that she had abandoned me for a common traveller, expecting that I would simply believe you, and mourn her loss, and eventually accept whatever match you had already begun arranging in her place." His eyes moved, briefly, and with a contempt that made her flinch visibly, to Lucinda. "You thought your womb gave you the right to rule my house," he said, turning back to his mother. "You thought 40 years of unchallenged authority meant that authority belonged to you permanently, regardless of what I built, regardless of who I chose to build it with. You were wrong, and you are about to understand exactly how completely wrong for the whole of whatever remains of your life." He gestured to the knights who had followed him into the hall, standing now at attention along its walls, awaiting his command with the disciplined readiness of men who had followed him through 6 months of brutal campaign and would follow him, without hesitation, through whatever came next. "Effective immediately," Alistair said. "You are stripped of your title, your wealth, and your freedom of movement within this estate, or any property connected to it. Guards, pack the Dowager Duchess's belongings, and escort her to the exact cold room she built for my wife. Let her spend the remainder of this winter reflecting on precisely what treason against her own son's household actually costs." Beatrice rose from her chair with a fury and a disbelief that had, until this precise moment, never once imagined that her son's love for Evangeline might prove strong enough to overcome 40 years of maternal authority. "Alistair, I am your mother." "You were my mother," Alistair said, before you became the woman who tortured my wife for 6 months and lied to my face about it within moments of my return. I do not know what you have become since, but I find I have very little further interest in discovering it." He looked at the guards. "Take her." Lucinda, understanding with a rapidly dawning horror that her own complicity in Beatrice's scheme left her with no protection whatsoever, now that the Dowager's authority had been so completely and permanently broken, attempted to flee the hall entirely, but was intercepted before she reached the door. "As for you," Alistair said, turning to face her directly, "you will be escorted to the border territories this same evening, with strict instruction to every family of consequence in the northern provinces regarding exactly what you participated in and exactly why you are no longer welcome in any respectable household within this empire's reach. I imagine you will find the borders considerably colder than you have ever previously experienced. I find I have no particular sympathy remaining to offer you regarding the discomfort." Lucinda was dragged from the hall, screaming protestations that no one present had the slightest remaining interest in hearing, and Beatrice followed shortly after, her 40 years of unchallenged dominance ending in a silence considerably more complete than any of the cruelty she had inflicted across the whole of that dominance's duration. The dining hall settled, in the aftermath of their departure, into a quiet that carried, for the first time in 6 months, the particular and unmistakable texture of genuine safety. Alistair knelt again before Evangeline's chair, examining her injured hands with a physician's careful attention until the estate's actual physician arrived, summoned within minutes of Alistair's return, to begin the long process of tending to the physical damage of her ordeal. "I am so sorry," Alistair said, holding her hands as gently as their raw and blistered condition required. "I should never have trusted my mother's account of anything. From the very beginning, I should have known." "You could not have known," Evangeline said, her voice growing stronger now with the warmth of the fur cloak and the fire that had been hastily built in the dining hall's great hearth. "You trusted your mother because she was your mother, and because you had no reason, until this moment, to imagine she was capable of what she actually did. That is not a fault in your character, Alistair. It is simply the ordinary trust a son extends to his mother, and the fault lies entirely with the woman who so completely betrayed it." She looked at him, seated in the high-backed master chair that had, for 40 years, belonged to whoever held Ravensmoor's genuine authority, wrapped in his fur cloak, with her injured hands held in his, and felt, for the first time in 6 months, the full weight of the ordeal finally beginning to lift. "I held on to the belief that you would come home and set this right," she said. "Every single day, in every single hour of the cold and the labor and the deliberate cruelty your mother and Lucinda inflicted, I held on to that belief, because I understood, even in my very worst moments, that the man who married me for my mind, rather than my bloodline, was not a man who would ever have wanted this for me, whatever lies he might temporarily be told. I will spend the rest of my life," Alistair said, "making certain you never have cause to doubt that belief again." In the months that followed, as Evangeline's health and strength gradually and fully recovered, Ravensmoor estate transformed under the joint governance of a duke and duchess, whose authority no longer required any concession whatsoever to the old prejudices of bloodline and lineage that had governed Beatrice's entire understanding of the world. Evangeline resumed her position at the head of the household with an authority that the staff, who had watched her endure 6 months of deliberate cruelty with an unbroken dignity they would never forget, extended to her now with a genuine and complete loyalty that Beatrice's 40 years of cold command had never once managed to earn. News of what had happened at Ravensmoor, of the Dowager Duchess's cruelty, and of the Duke's absolute and public reckoning against it, spread through the northern provinces with a speed that ensured no family of consequence in the region would ever again doubt exactly what became of anyone who mistook Evangeline Renfrew's grace and composure for weakness. She sat, in the years that followed, at the head of the great table in the dining hall where her ordeal had finally and completely ended, and every guest who dined at that table, whatever their private opinions about bloodlines and lineage might once have been, understood, without ever needing to be told directly, exactly whose house they were sitting in, and exactly what would happen to anyone who dared to threaten its duchess again. And so ends tonight's tale. The frost didn't freeze my memory. A story about a mother's cruelty so complete, she believed her own authority could survive anything, even the return of the son whose love for his wife she had so catastrophically underestimated. A story about a duchess who endured 6 months of deliberate torment with a silent and unbreakable dignity, and who held, through every freezing hour of her darkest confinement, to a faith in her husband's love that ultimately proved to be the one thing her tormentors could never take from her. A story about the particular and absolute reckoning that arrives when cruelty finally meets the one force it never accounted for. A love strong enough to burn down an entire house of lies in a single afternoon and rebuild, from its ashes, something considerably more honest than what existed before. And now, our question for you tonight, the one we want you to answer in the comments below. If you were Evangeline, if you had endured 6 months of deliberate cruelty and 2 weeks of freezing darkness, holding on to nothing but your faith that your husband would return and set it right, would you have found the strength to hold on to that faith the way she did? Would your first words, upon finally being freed, have been words of triumph, or would you simply have wept? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment, and we love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who has ever endured cruelty in silence, waiting for the truth to finally come home, and who deserves to be reminded that the frost, however deep, does not have to freeze what truly matters. Until next time, may you always hold fast to what you know is true, even in the coldest and darkest rooms, and may the people who love you come home in time. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.